It's Michelle Caruana from Play Cafe Academy and Profitable Play. And in today's video, I wanted to talk about something that I don't really talk a whole lot about on this channel. And that's been for a couple reasons. So, reason number one, I'm not a lawyer, surprise, surprise. So, just a heads up, this video is in no way meant to be legal advice or act as a replacement for legal advice, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. So, hang tight. But I also cover this phase of opening your indoor playground business in detail in my Play Cafe Academy course. So, understanding different types of leases, what different leases are going to cost you, how to choose a location, how to negotiate a lease, all that good stuff. But I've noticed that, especially over like the last 6 or so months, I've noticed that this phase of the opening process, so after you've envisioned your business and you've validated your business concept, you've done your competitive analysis, you likely have a first draft of your business plan completed, whether you've used my $27 business plan toolkit, which is linked under the video, or if you've chosen to kind of create one from scratch. You have that first draft in your hand and you're ready to start calling up landlords and looking at spaces. And you're so excited to start sending out letter of intents to potential spaces and landlords. But I've noticed that, again, this phase of the opening an indoor playground process has really been tripping people up lately. And it can be demanding, it can be very draining. And as I mentioned in one of my recent videos, it's really difficult, more so now than ever, to even get a landlord to hear you out about opening something like an indoor playground or a play cafe. Because a lot of landlords don't understand the business concept. They aren't really interested in leasing to startups because they're risky and they're kind of holding out for a franchise like a Pizza Hut or something like that to come in and put pen to paper because they're generally a lot less risky. They're willing to pay more in rent, all that good stuff. So I'm going to link that video as well in the video description because I think it's a really important watch, especially if you're going to be one of the first indoor playgrounds or play cafes in your area. So I'm going to link to that one. But I've talked a lot about how landlords are not even willing a lot of times to hear you out and take a look at your business plan. And that only means that when you get past the landlord and you actually get a lease to look at and negotiate on, that process can be even more overwhelming than that initial space hunt that you go on when you're, again, first looking for a space to call home for your business. So, any chance that I get to kind of shed some light and experience on something that you guys are having trouble with, I'm going to take it. So, again, while I'm not going to cover all the different types of leases you'll encounter and all of the different terms you're going to see and things like that, I wanted to talk about a couple really important terms and clauses in particular that I've seen pop up in the indoor playground industry specifically, especially over the last couple months as we're exiting a pandemic and kind of going into an economic recession. So these are some terms that I didn't really know about prior to this. I mean, I had rented plenty of apartments, I had signed plenty of leases, but a lot of these terms not only don't exist in residential real estate or leasing or anything like that, a lot of them actually have a different meaning in the commercial space. So I'm going to go over some of the terms that I really want you to know and feel empowered with going into this process with. But one point that I really want to drive home in this video, and if you have one takeaway from this, it's that I want you to be really careful who you hire to help you with negotiations for your lease. So typically, you will have to hire someone to negotiate on your behalf, and they're going to have to be a lawyer. However, what I've seen a lot of people be really tempted to do is hire their cousin that's a lawyer or hire their friend that's maybe, a employment law lawyer or an estate lawyer or something like that. And they don't have the experience in commercial real estate that you absolutely need when negotiating a lease, especially if you're looking at, 5 or more years. This is a big deal. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen indoor playground owners get hit with massive bills like 2 or 3 years into their business And by massive, I mean like $20 to $50,000 bills. So maybe it's, the building's tax was reassessed and the landlord had sneakily worked into the lease that that's now the tenant's responsibility. Or maybe, the roof caved in and hey, there's a sneaky clause in the lease that says you as a tenant are responsible for a portion of it. There are so many ways that landlords and uh, commercial leasing uh, commercial leasing group. So, for example, if you're looking to lease from a property management group, there are so many sneaky clauses that they try to, get past you that really make the lease more favorable to them as the landlords and really disproportionately unfavorable to you as the tenant. I can't tell you how many times I've seen this happen. And the best way to avoid this and avoid any surprises down the line is again to hire a lawyer that is really specialized in commercial real estate and has experience negotiating leases. So, again, resist that temptation to hire the first lawyer that you know or a family member just because they're willing to give you a little bit of a discount or even work pro bono or free. It's not going to be worth it in the end, I promise you. Again, because I've seen it firsthand. All right, so now we're going to get into, again, some of the clauses that I really want you to be prepared to hear when you go to negotiate a lease. And the first one is an escape clause. And I'm going to put the definition on the screen so you can read it. I'm going to do that with all these, and don't mind me while I read from my phone. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to get any of these definitions wrong. But again, the first one is an escape clause. An escape clause is a set of provisions that are included in certain contracts, like a lease, that allow the contract to be terminated without repercussions. So this is going to be very different. The exact terms of an escape clause are going to be different based on the landlord and the tenant and your specific lease agreement. But what I've seen a lot lately, especially again in a post-pandemic world, as we head into a recession, is I've seen a lot of landlords put these in, and a lot of times they're mutually beneficial. So they can be enacted by either the landlord or the tenant. So a lot of times, unfortunately, if the landlord just decides, hey, I want to terminate this lease, you're kicked out. That can be a huge disruption and a huge blow to your business. So again, be really cognizant of who this escape clause is actually benefiting, who can actually exercise this escape clause option, because if the escape clause is only able to be exercised by the tenant, that means that at any time, if you decide that your business isn't working out or you want to move locations or you just want to pack up and close up shop, whatever the case may be, because again, something I talk about a lot in this business is that anything can happen. You or someone you loved could fall ill, or you could suffer a tragedy, or you could need to move for whatever reason. There are so many things that can pop up. So these clauses are really important to consider. But let's say the escape clause is only able to be exercised by the tenant. That means if you want to close up shop, you're able to exit your lease. And sure, you're going to eat a lot of your costs that went into your build out, and you're going to have to pay to transport all of your equipment or sell it and things like that. But you're not going to be able to, your landlord is not going to be able to come after you for the remaining rent. And I'm actually going to put out a video right after this one talking about exactly what happens when you do break a lease and there is no escape clause. So what the repercussions are, what the consequences are, what you'll be on the hook for, what assets exactly, not just business assets, but personal assets the landlord can come after. And we're going to talk about that more in a moment, but I'm going to put out that video right after this one. So watch out for it. But again, an escape clause can be a really great tool. You just, again, want to be careful that it's going to be in your favor or at least mutually beneficial. So you don't want the landlord to stick an escape clause in and only have themselves be able to exercise it, because that means they could kick you out on the street, but you don't have that same right as a tenant. So you really want to be careful with this. And what I've seen a lot is that landlords will put escape clauses in, but they're only able to be exercised, like let's say after 2 years. So after 2 years of, paying rent and being a tenant in good standing, that's when you can start exercising that escape clause. So whether it's able to be enacted upon right in the beginning or after a couple years, this is something to really pay attention to. And if you're really nervous about the riskiness of this business model, or if you're not sure what your family is going to be going through or where you're going to be located or anything like that over the next couple years, an escape clause is definitely something to talk to your lawyer about. And you may want to include it. Just again, be very cognizant of those little details because they matter. All right, and that brings me to my next term. And this one is one that there's a lot of misconceptions around, and that is a personal guarantee. So the term personal guarantee refers to an individual's legal promise to repay credit issued to a business for which they serve as an executive or partner. So in layman's terms, basically, if you decide to break your lease and you don't have an escape clause or anything like that, or if your escape clause hasn't gone into effect yet, that means that if you personally guarantee a lease, that means that your landlord can then come after your personal assets to recoup that loss that they have in terms of lost rent. And not only lost rent, but they could come after you as well for advertising costs, listing costs, real estate fees. They could come after you for any cost they incur, basically, that come about in the process of finding and renting to a new tenant. So they could sue you for legal fees. And again, we're going to talk about that in my next video. I had to split this up into two parts to really make it clear and concise. But a lot of people hear this and they think, oh, well, I would never enter into a lease with a personal guarantee. So a lot of people say, absolutely not. I'm not putting my personal assets at risk. I will never sign a lease with a personal guarantee. And this is where the misconceptions come in, because unfortunately, what I have seen is that most, and when I say most, I mean like 99.999% of landlords, most of them will not lease or rent to a startup business without a personal guarantee. And a lot of times your bank, if you're looking for a loan or anything like that, a lot of times you'll also have to personally guarantee your loan. Again, especially if you're a startup business and this isn't your second or third location and you don't have substantial business assets yet. So sure, in a perfect world, we would never sign a personal guarantee because it does open up our livelihoods and our family's livelihoods to this potential risk of defaulting on our lease. But again, I just wanted to be completely honest with you in that it's going to be really, really difficult to negotiate this out of the lease. And I have seen people do it. However, what a landlord's response is usually in this scenario is, oh, you don't want to sign a lease with a personal guarantee. Now you're going to be paying double rent and your lease terms are going to be, double the length or something like that. They really try to, almost penalize you from removing this clause out of their contract. And it's almost meant to raise the rent to such a level that it completely prices you out of renting that space. So essentially, they're deterring you from saying yes because, again, they really want that personal guarantee. They don't want you to be able to just wake up one day and decide, you know what, I'm closing my business. I'm dissolving my LLC. I'm going to sell off all my assets. And, my landlord, oh, well, they're SOL, if you know what that means. I'm not going to say it because this is a PG channel. But again, so I wanted you to understand not only what a personal guarantee was, but also how unavoidable it is most times, especially again, as we head into a recession, and especially with a startup business and a business model that may not be proven yet in your area. So again, if you want some tips on how to communicate with landlords and educate them about this business model and get them to say yes, again, likely with a personal guarantee, watch my last video. I'm going to link to it in the video description. Now, the next thing that has come up a lot is a non-compete clause. Now, when a lot of people hear a non-compete clause, they automatically think of like an employment contract. So in that sense, a non-compete means that, oh, if I hire you, you can't quit and then go work for a competitor for like at least 2 years. But in a commercial real estate setting, it actually means something different. So in this case, a non-compete clause. Wow, this one is really giving me trouble today. But it's essentially an agreement between the landlord and potential tenant that the landlord will not rent space to a competitor of the tenant or to a business that draws the same customers who may choose to do business with one tenant as opposed to another. And this comes up really often in the cases of malls or plazas or something like that. So, my personal experience with this is that when we were opening our second location, it was in a plaza, and the same property management group owned the entire plaza. And there was a cafe and coffee shop in that plaza. Now, when that coffee shop signed their lease, it had a non compete clause in it. So we had to do so much work in this negotiation process to kind of prove that our customers at a indoor playground slash cafe were not going to be the same customers that were going to be frequenting this coffee shop. And we also had to prove that our revenue from this cafe was going to be less than like 15% of our total revenue. So there are ways to kind of get around these non-compete clauses. So we did end up being able to lease in that space. And there were some restrictions in terms of what we could produce. Again, how much of our revenue was able to be made up of cafe sales and things like that. But again, it all came down to really having a rock solid business plan and educating our potential landlord about what our business was all about, why somebody wouldn't just, stand in front of two coffee shops and say, you know what, I'm on my way to work, but I'm going to go stop in this one with, a million kids running around and, all that stuff instead of this, let's say Dunkin' Donuts type coffee shop. Again, we had a completely different ideal customer. People were frequenting our businesses for completely different purposes. And the cafe was more of an aside aspect to our business. It was not our main focus. But when you're looking at plazas or malls or anything like that, just be very aware of these non-compete clauses. And before you spend any money negotiating a lease, the first thing that I would ask is there another indoor playground, a play cafe, or a coffee shop, or even a daycare, anything like that in this plaza or space? And if so, do you have a non-compete clause in place? Because a lot of times it doesn't come up until like the final stages of the negotiation process. And by that time, you might have already spent 20 hours. You may have spent 20 hours paying your lawyer to negotiate all of the terms and then say, oh my gosh, we could have never signed this lease anyways without opening a cafe. And if you want to learn why I think a cafe is absolutely essential to your business, I have a podcast series on that. I will also link that below this video. But just be very aware of these non-compete clauses because they can really, bite you in the butt in that sense. However, they can be really beneficial if you're renting in a plaza or a mall and you don't want another very similar competitor coming into that space. So if there isn't anything similar to your business, you might want to ask about this and say, hey, I'd really love to sign this lease, but I don't want you to rent to any of my potential competitors. Can we put a non-compete clause in this lease? And again, it might change your terms a little bit. It might change your rent a little bit, but oftentimes it's really beneficial to you to, again, prevent potential competitors from entering your space. Now, I'm not really sure why a potential competitor would want to be so close to you. But again, it's just something that you might want to think about adding and at least having a conversation with your lawyer about. But be really careful about this because they're much more common than you think. All right, the next phrase or term that I wanted to talk about is right of first refusal. And this is, again, something that means completely different in the residential real estate market as it does in the commercial real estate market. And this came up in my personal experience because, to be honest, we really didn't want to lease or rent. We really wanted to own our space. We wanted to have that asset in our business. And unfortunately, there was just no places to buy in our local area. So when we went to go into lease negotiations, we explained all of this to our commercial real estate lawyer. And we kind of said, how can we go about this such that if the landlord ever puts the property up for sale, we can, have the opportunity to purchase it? Because unfortunately, what I've seen happen a lot of times is the landlord will put a piece of property on the market, and then whoever sells it changes the lease terms or raises the rent. Because again, these are all clauses that landlords sneak into your leases to protect them, because it's going to be much more attractive for a potential purchaser of a property if there is a clause that says, hey, there's all these existing tenants, and guess what? You're allowed to raise their rent. There's nothing in their leases that protects them against raised rent in the event of a sale. So a lot of landlords, again, will try to sneak these clauses in. So let's say you rent a space and they, like I said, sell it to somebody else, and that person raises your rent or kicks you out, or, something like that, or completely changes your lease terms. That is kind of like a nightmare scenario. So what we wanted, again, in our lease, this was put into our lease agreement, was the right of first refusal, which essentially means that if our landlord were to ever put the space on the market, we would at least be able to decide whether or not we wanted to purchase it. This doesn't mean that we absolutely had to purchase it, but the right of first refusal kind of means exactly that. We had to refuse to purchase the property before they were able to list it and find other potential purchasers or potential clients to purchase this building. And again, that really protected us, and it served our interest because, again, our whole goal was to eventually purchase our space. So that's something really good to put in your lease to protect you against that, especially if, again, owning your space is a goal of yours, like it was mine. All right, the next and last term that I wanted to talk about before we talk about some other tips around lease negotiation is option to renew. So a lot of times people will sign between 2 to 5 year leases in this indoor playground space. Now, I always had in my mind that I wanted to operate my business for a period of time and then I wanted to sell it. So it was really important to me to not extend my lease any longer than, like, let's say 5 years, which is exactly the term that I signed on my lease. However, I knew that if I were to go to sell my business, it would be really attractive for that potential purchaser to have an option to renew my lease and the option to transfer that lease to them. And what's great about an option to renew is that it often locks in those terms. So either your rent stays the same if you renew, or it gets raised on a set schedule. So for example, if you are paying $5,000 a month in the last year of your rent, let's say you have the option to renew at a 2% per year rent increase. I love that it locks in these terms, because if the real estate market goes absolutely crazy, or a recession really affects rent or rent prices, or if taxes change or anything like that, it really protects you or somebody who's going to be purchasing your business against the lease terms changing too dramatically upon renewal. So again, it's not just the fact that you have the option to renew, it's the fact that you can have control over what those terms are going to be. Because again, if you do go to ever sell your business, that's going to be one of the first questions that they want answered. They're going to want to know, do I have to negotiate an entire new lease? Can the lease be transferred? What happens in 2 years when the lease expires? Am I going to open myself up to my rent all of a sudden, doubling or tripling, or the lease type to change or anything like that? So locking these terms in when you sign the lease, again, protects you and any future owners you may be working with against any shady business during that lease renewal process. So again, this is something that you really want to have a discussion with your lawyer about, and putting the most favorable terms as possible to you as a tenant into that lease. You're definitely not going to get everything that you want or everything you desire. Again, this is a negotiation, aka a compromise. But again, this is something to definitely bring up in conversation with your lawyer. And then some other points of negotiation that I wanted to mention are building insurance. So this comes up so often in the lease negotiation process. And I've seen a lot of people, for lack of a better word, this is just like the first word that's coming to mind, but I've seen a lot of people be like bamboozled in this process, and they end up having to take out an insurance policy on like the entire building, or an unfair amount of the percentage of the insurance. Because not only will you need business liability insurance and unemployment insurance and disability insurance and workers' comp insurance, a lot of times you'll also need whole building insurance. So structural insurance, fire insurance, flood insurance. And honestly, most times that falls at the hands of the landlord. But sometimes they will try to unfairly pass these insurance costs and these insurance premiums onto you. So, this is something to really be cognizant of. And again, have a conversation with your lawyer about it and try to avoid paying any insurance premiums that you shouldn't have to as a tenant, right? The overall building, structurally wise, is the landlord's responsibility. And those costs should fall on them. Another thing that this comes up, honestly, I would say 100% of the time when somebody is opening an indoor playground or a play cafe, and that is the rent during build out. And this, unfortunately, is a lot of people's like breaking points that really puts their business into such a deep hole before they even open that it really makes it almost impossible for them to ultimately be successful. So, what I mean by that is a lot of times when you're negotiating a lease, you'll negotiate a specified period for build out. So, let's say it's like 2 or 3 months that you negotiate. And during that 2 or 3 month period where your build out is taking place, a lot of times you'll be able to negotiate either a severely decreased rent or paying no rent at all. And that is very common. You should absolutely not be paying rent during your build out. Unfortunately, what happens is a lot of times your build out ends up being a lot longer than you anticipated. So this is another conversation, another, honest talk that you want to have with your lawyer. Say, listen, it's very common in this industry to have build outs last a lot longer than anticipated. So talk about, what's going to happen if my build out is actually 5 months instead of 3? Can we negotiate some sort of rent reduction during that period in the event something happens, or in the event of inclement weather or supply chain delays or anything like that? You really want to explore all of these different scenarios and these different options to, at the very least, understand what you're going to be on the hook for, when you're going to be on the hook for it, and what happens if something goes awry in the lease process. Because again, I hate to see indoor playground owners having to pay tens of thousands of dollars in rent before they even open due to factors like supply chain issues that they cannot control whatsoever. So this is something to talk about not only with your attorney, but also your landlord and say, listen, what happens if it's delayed? Can we put some sort of clause in there, some sort of protection for me? Things like that. So that's just something to talk about. The next thing I wanted to talk about is snow removal and lawn care. So again, this is going to be very dependent on your lease type. So whether you have like a gross lease or a triple net lease, again, I go over all of this in my Play Cafe Academy course and really differentiate between all of the different types of leases you may encounter and what you should and should not be responsible for in each. But this is something that even in a lease where the landlord is responsible for a lot of that external maintenance, a lot of times I'll see them try to sneak snow removal and lawn care as one of the tenant's responsibility. And I want to encourage you and your lawyer to push back on this. And I also want you to come up with terms around the specifics of this. I talk about this a lot, but one of the biggest factors that we came up with, and one of those, really big pain points in our entire business process, was honestly snow removal. We were in Rochester, New York. We got so much snow, and our business was in a two business plaza. So it was us and it was a restaurant. And our landlord also happened to own the restaurant. So not only did he own the building, but he also owned the restaurant. And the restaurant didn't open until noon on the weekends. And oftentimes on weekdays, it didn't open until 4. And we opened around 8 or 9 a.m. And a lot of times, because our lease didn't specify, what time the snow had to be removed by, because we were able to negotiate this, and our landlord was 100% responsible for external maintenance, window washing, lawn care, snow removal, everything like that. But our lease didn't say snow needs to be removed by this time or by the time the business is open. So I can't tell you, it had to have been over 100 times where we would be open, ready for business, and our customers literally could not walk through our parking lot or push a stroller through it, or walk their kids through it, because our landlord wouldn't plow our lot until when the restaurant opened around 3 or 4 p.m. when we were getting ready to close for the day. So again, not only do I want you to push back on incurring these costs as a tenant, I also want to encourage you to put some specifics around who they need to hire for this, because also our landlord would also have like his 12-year-old son shovel our parking lot, or he'd have like his buddy come and shovel it or something like that. And I wish I would have put a clause in our lease that said not only is the landlord responsible for snow removal and lawn care, but it has to be a professional company that does these services. It can't be, a minor. It can't be his friend who's going to show up whenever he pleases. And I can't tell you how many times our, signs and things like that were damaged because people were not professionals and they were trying to, snowplow our lot. So again, I want you to put as many specifics in this clause as possible to really protect you, especially if you have different hours of operation, excuse me, in terms of other businesses in your area or other businesses that your landlord might also lease to. All right, and then the last thing I wanted to mention in terms of other points of negotiation is external maintenance. So again, I mentioned window washing and lawn care and snow removal, but also, what happens if your roof caves in? What happens if a pipe bursts or something is damaged? Or, what happens if a tree falls on your space? I want you to have all of these different conversations and scenarios hashed out with your lawyer before you go into lease negotiations, because again, this is something that you, in most cases, should not be responsible for as a tenant. These should fall under the landlord's responsibility, again, in most cases. So depending on your area, depending on what inclement weather you might face, whether it's snow or hurricanes or flooding or anything like that, I really want you to, again, try to make these terms as favorable as possible to you. And these are not costs that I would recommend incurring. And speaking of other costs that I would not recommend incurring, I wanted to give you some examples of things that you might be able to negotiate into your build out cost in terms of, getting your landlord to quote unquote split the bill with you that, again, you might not have even thought of. And these are things that I've seen done firsthand. So these are not hypothetical examples, and I'll give my experience as well. So number one is bathrooms. Bathrooms can often cost, especially if you're building from scratch, a lot of times bathrooms can cost tens of thousands of dollars. I think ours were quoted at around $40,000. And we were actually able to reason with our landlord and have them pay for the entire bathroom. So not only the actual plumbing, but the toilet, the counter, the flooring. We had to pay for paint and like our toilet paper dispensers and our soap dispensers and things like that. But all of like the bones for our bathroom were able to be negotiated into our build out and paid for by our landlord. And that's because these bathrooms will often be able to be used by future tenants. So adding these bathrooms is adding concrete value to the building. Again, it can be reused in future businesses. So this is something to, again, negotiate. You may not get all of these items included, but I have seen this included plenty of times. And I have a lot of tips around negotiating these types of things, again, in my Play Cafe Academy course. And I give all my secret sauce specifics there. But again, I'm just going through this list kind of rapid fire just to get the wheels turning in your brain to really start, being smart about these negotiations and walking away, saving as much money as possible in your initial startup costs. All right. And then kind of similar to bathrooms is plumbing. So if you're planning on a cafe or a hand washing station or a drinking fountain or anything like that, that's also something that adds concrete value to the building that can be reused in future tenants. So if, for example, your building needs, an additional pipe or something like that, again, I'm not a contractor, I don't know the specifics, but this is often something that you can negotiate into your startup cost that your landlord is going to pay for, or at least split the bill with you and pay for some percentage of any plumbing work that's being done in the building. And then I also wanted to talk about sprinkler systems. So depending on how your space is going to be organized and what your business is going to be categorized as and your local laws, you may need to add a sprinkler system to the business. A lot of times these older buildings don't have sprinkler systems that are going to be adequate enough for current standards. So if you have to add a sprinkler system and that's what your, town or fire marshal has come back with, that is absolutely something to at least get your landlord to pay partially, because that's something that is going to be in their business now forever. They're now going to be compliant for anyone they rent to in the future, again, depending on how their space ends up being organized. But this is something that they should pay for, or at least you shouldn't be footing the whole bill for. The next thing is signage. So our building, again, was like literally dirt when we leased it. So it didn't have any of the normal things that an established building would have. And an example of one of those things is signage. So based on like aesthetics, because again, our landlord owned the restaurant next door, they really wanted us to have a sign that wasn't backlit, but instead had like two spotlights kind of shining on it in the evening hours. And I said, okay, that's fine. If that's the sign that you want to have on your building, that's fine. But that's going to make it $7,000 more. So because they were so specific about the sign that they wanted us to have, we were able to get them to pay for it. So our signage was going to be around $13,000, and they ended up paying around $8,000 of that. Again, because it wasn't our fault that they wanted our sign to be, very specific and have very specific aesthetics. So we were able to get them to foot that, because again, that lighting and that electrical work and those spotlights, if you remove our sign and put another sign there, that's going to be able to, again, be reused by the next tenant. So again, that's something to kind of keep in mind as a rule of thumb. If you're adding value to this space, and if that value can be reused by the next tenant, so if it's not like paint or light fixtures that you're going to be taking with you or anything like that, that's something that you should be negotiating. Again, you're not going to get all these line items included likely, but you might as well shoot for the stars and, ask for as favorable of terms as possible going into it, because then you're going to, again, end up in a much better place than you would if you were to aim low. So at least have them meet you in the middle with a lot of these different components that you're going to have to add into your build out costs. So again, that wraps up today's video. I hope it was really helpful. And again, the one big takeaway I want you to have from this video is to hire someone experienced in commercial real estate to negotiate your lease. It's going to give you so much unnecessary, expensive, and headaches down the line if you don't. So again, this video was not meant to be legal advice. I really just wanted to, again, help you feel a little bit more empowered sitting at that table, acting as your own aide in these negotiations alongside your lawyer, because it can get really confusing and it can be such a draining process, especially if you're looking at, 5, 6, 7 different leases. So again, these are just some terms and clauses that I want you to be on the lookout for. And again, I wish you the best. This is a tough process. If you're really struggling here, I just wanted to say you are not alone. It is very difficult, but still doable right now. So again, if you want any of my guidance, or if you want to work with me in this process to get your vision launched, all of my links, all of my free and paid resources are linked in the video description. I would love to help you bring your dream business to life with, less expenses and less stress than you ever thought possible. That's why I created my business and this channel. All right, again, like this video if you found it helpful, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you soon. Bye for now.